Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Seriously Business Life podcast. My name is Jake, an entrepreneur who does many different industries, and this is Jolie, a 35 plus year HR professional, and my co host. And this week, we are going to be talking about leadership
Mm.
and what leadership really means, because I do think it's a vastly misunderstood position. Because I think a lot of people think of leaders as, I mean, to an extent, this is true, but egotistical, I run everything, yada, yada,
Mm.
yada people. When being at least a good leader, I think is a very, very, very different thing. You know what I mean? Like, kind of that realm of where does the end of the insanity line find itself and where does the beginning of genius? It's kind of like that with leadership, where does becoming a good leader become being a bad leader?
Well, and I think there's a difference between being a leader and being in management.
Yes.
And so you're talking a lot about management stuff. And then I kind of broke down what does it mean to be sorry if you're audio, you may hear squeaking. Jake might edit it out, but one of the dogs is making all kinds of
I'll
noise. So
try,
we'll see what we can. If you
certainly.
hear that, that's what that is. Don't panic. But I kind of wrote down the difference here between like being a people leader and what that might look like. Um, kind of I asked myself with some questions that I thought your listeners might have. But then I also talk about, what does it mean to be a leader when it comes to projects? Maybe you're not a manager, maybe you're not managing people, but maybe, you'd like to step up and be the lead of a particular project. And what might that look like? And then the last piece that I broke this into is, what if you have a bad leader? Maybe some thoughts and tips and tricks. We haven't brought that up for a while. That might help you if you have a bad leader. So,
Well, I think the first thing we kind of have to cover in that regard is what a leader is, right?
mm,
Because I think the biggest issue in the department of leadership is people who are leaders and people who look up at leaders don't fully understand what being a leader really means. Because the reason I think maybe you took a lot of the things I talk about as managerial position stuff, that's how a lot of people look at leaders,
mhm,
right? A lot of people think, oh, the leaders just put things together. They just guide the thing. They just do this. They just do
mm.
that. When leadership has a lot more to do than that in its position,
Well, and
right?
yeah, I think you're right because I think it kind of gets back to on a different podcast we talked about gender versus sex. I think gender is to sex, perhaps as leader is to management.
Yes.
A management is a position, and this is my opinion. I'm not going to say, Webster's dictionary says, but a manager is usually it's an appointed position. So you're going to be responsible for other people's work, other people's time. It's as simple as, setting the hours worked, approving time if somebody, is managing time on a project or tracks their time. It's approving time off. It's making sure that things get done. It's presenting up. That's kind of the formal side of it being you're a manager, and you can be a manager for your entire career and never be a leader. And you can be a leader and never have people reporting to you. And I don't want to get too philosophical, but I think we're talking about, what does it mean to lead people, to be a people leader? And I think that's a nomenclature shift where we talk less about, I'm the manager, I'm a director. Those are levels of leadership responsibility. And you typically have two tracks. You have an individual contributor track that you may become a deep subject matter expert, but you never have a team that reports to you. You might have a team that you work in and you may lead team projects. That's what was my second piece. But then you have managers. And I think that really is the difference. A leader is a leader because they contribute something to individuals that is different than managing their day-to-day work.
Mhm.
A leader inspires. Usually a leader is allowing I always say, and some people have reported to me may say that they think I'm more of a manager than a leader. I'm not going to say that that isn't possible, but I think as a leader, one of your responsibilities is to tell a little less and to ask a little more. Managers tell. go do these things. Leaders say, well, what are you interested in working on? What do you need to get this job done? Why are we behind on the timeline?
Mhm.
Versus a manager would say, well, we're behind on the timeline. You need to fix that. They're both the same thing. I also think personally that a good leader, because I'm trying to talk a little bit about good leaders are thinking about the responsibility and the burden of leadership that they carry. So, I have had people on my team many times in my career that as a person, I didn't really like them.
Mhm.
Maybe they were arrogant. Maybe they were difficult. Maybe they didn't want to come to work. Maybe they didn't do good work. But I was always trying to figure out how could I motivate and inspire them differently. Now, in my career, even below me, I have had to, address discipline. I have had to terminate many times because somebody has done something either so egregious that they can't continue. They've stolen something. They've hurt somebody, they've falsified documents. Those are things that, as a leader or as a manager, you address and you move on. I think a leader though is looking maybe to some extent of, before those things start happening, and sometimes people just have bad behaviors, but how do you start to see some indications, right? Because there's a great saying, that um it's a slow fade from doing one thing and then another and another and another. And I think a manager just catches you as things happen. A leader starts to say, you're on a bit of a slippery slope. That probably wasn't unethical, but let's talk about how if it goes a little bit further, you're going to go down the wrong path. Because sometimes you don't see that happening. And a leader is, I think, that proactive person who, to some extent, is kind of putting the mirror up and say, look in the mirror. Is this really where you want to go? Where a manager is just going to say, you stepped outside of the bounds. I'm addressing it. Um, and so to me, that's kind of the difference. I think that people follow leaders, they comply to managers.
Well, and I think what's something to come back to, and this is kind of grammatically nerdy in a way, is it's called leader for a reason.
Yes.
It's not called micromanager, you know?
Yes.
The point of being a leader is not the idea of, because I think a lot of people look at when they get a higher position and they lead people or they are in charge of people, which is different, right? I think leader, you are leading them, right? Where a lot of people at least look up to leaders as more of they tell you what direction to run, you know? And
Well,
that's different.
and to me, that's not a leader,
It's
that's
not,
a
yeah.
manager. But I also think it's really interesting, so I don't wanna step too far from this topic, but let's kinda talk about, how do leaders get there? I think if you have a leader or a manager, whatever you I'm gonna use them interchangeably for a minute, who has never led people before,
Mhm.
they're gonna make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
You're not I mean, you hear leaders are born, not made. I somewhat disagree. I think some people have charisma and they may have a character that people want to follow. They have a vision that people want to follow. But if you've never led people before, you don't really know how to do it. It's kind of like riding a bike. Once you learn how to ride the bike and you understand the mechanics of it, you're shaky in the beginning and you're going to make mistakes. And then you'll be riding really well. But let's say you learn to ride in town and now you're out in the country and you're mountain biking, you're going to make more mistakes because it's a different terrain. And so it takes quite a period of time to know how to do all these things. And very few leaders see everything that can happen in a group that they lead.
Yeah.
I just the other day had somebody come to me and presented something, and he said, I've never seen this before. I don't know what to do. He's in his late 40s. He's been a leader for probably 20 years, but it was something that he had never seen before. And, leaders need counsel, leaders need advice, leaders need to seek out other leaders. And that's part of the role of HR, right? Is to listen to it and say, okay, well, let's not overreact. That is problematic. And this might be, what we need to understand. And typically HR is going to be looking for the motivation behind things. But I think that, to your point, you know, a manager tells. But I also think, like I said, to deviate a minute, I think before you become a people leader, you should learn to be a project leader,
Mhm.
because the hardest thing to do is to get work done through others when you're not managing them.
Yeah.
And so we talked about it in one of the prior podcasts about group work. Uh,
Oh
that's
gosh.
that's a project leader, right? And so a project leader doesn't have to be strictly in project management, but I'll give a scenario. I have a newer professional on my team who, is a few years into their career, and they're still very much in that space of, I am given a scope of work, I'm trained, I do that scope of work, and then I might attend meetings and listen, but I'm responding to what I'm being told. I'm not really solving problems on
Mhm.
my own. I'm taking input and I'm executing it. And we had a big project to implement, and one of the things that I said to this person's leader is, I think you need to give this person that responsibility. Now, you're going to have oversight because they've never done it before and it's big. The project is big for the company. But if they don't have the accountability and the responsibility, they've learned to ask questions because they've got about a year of attending other meetings and listening to project questions. But if they're not accountable for that project, if they don't have to think through, how do I organize this work and get it done? Who are my stakeholders? Who needs to know what? And I don't want to get too far down other things, but in the business world, we talk about a RACI. Have you ever heard of a RACI?
Yes.
Okay. So that's who's responsible,
Mhm.
who's accountable, who's support, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed. It is I've been doing races since I first started working in the late '80s, early '90s. So races are not new. Sometimes you don't see the C in the racy, but
Well, and for some people, just so people follow along, that's RASCI is how you
yes.
spell it.
Yes, that's
Just to be clear.
responsible. That's fair. That's why you call it a racy, because it's responsible,
Yes.
accountable. So it's an acronym. But, I think that some things are so good they can stand the test of time. And a racy is really one of those. Maybe we can pop up a little visual. I can give you a visual on a racy. But if you have your first project or you're an entrepreneur and you're starting your own company, trying to understand what role each person plays.
Mhm.
So a lot of times in my position, I'm either consulted or I'm informed. But when you're first doing your career, you're going to spend a lot of time in the responsible and the accountable. So, responsible means you're doing the work, you're responsible for getting the work done. Accountable is where your leader comes in. They're accountable for making sure who's responsible gets the work done.
Yeah.
They're accountable for making sure whoever is support is playing a role. They're accountable for the people getting consulted. They're accountable for people getting informed. And so there's a lot of times that you will play multiple roles as a leader in there. And I think good leadership starts with an opportunity to project manage and be responsible and accountable for getting work done through others, but really having no direct line of authority, because that to me creates a leader. When you're given all of that as a manager and you haven't learned how to influence, which is what that whole thing I just talked about, being responsible for a project, you're learning to influence. You're learning to get people to want to do the work. You're learning to do silly things. And as crazy as this sounds, showing up and having fun at the beginning of those project meetings. I can remember it was very impactful, and it might sound a little kitschy, but I can remember early in my career, one of the pieces of advices that I got, there used to be these little candy bars, they were called kudos, and a leader said, take a whole bunch of those to the meeting. And when someone is on track, hand out a kudos. Kudos to you. Kudos to you. I know that sounds really silly, but people then wanted the kudos. I wanted to do something to give myself a kudos. So that's just an example. Maybe it could be I know, a bottle of water or a can of soda or, you know, candy or something that you brought in. And a lot of times trainers will use this, right? When you train, you ask a question and you'll say, hey, hey, catch this Kit Kat or try to use things that relate to more to maybe kisses are sometimes a little people used to hand kisses a lot and it just has more of a romantic meaning. Somebody has 15 kisses. Oh, look how many times you kissed her. So think about things that are a little less charged, but that to me is the beginning of being a leader. And many of us may have leaders. That's why I want to talk about what if you have a bad leader. We may have leaders that didn't have that in their developmental journey. And it's really easy to get frustrated and say, that leader sucks. And some of them do. Some people are not made to be managers and they're not made to be leaders. And I think one of my biggest pet peeves being in HR are, I'm going to use the word leader, who don't give credit where credit is due, who demoralize and demean people and then take their work and sell it as their own. Those are things that are
Before we
not
get too
leadership.
far into that topic, because
Mhm.
you are kind of shifting pretty
Okay.
quickly here, let's go back to the idea of hello, kitty cat. We have animals all over this
Today.
episode. You can find us on YouTube at Faux Productions and watch this episode where you will see the kitty cat once again, who is all up in my business. Um, but what I wanted to say was, I want to give a real world example of what you just went through,
Okay.
right? Talking about transitioning into a leader position from a different position.
Individual contributors,
Yeah,
you
individual
call.
contributor. In my business, I know we have multiple different divisions. We have a production division, which this podcast is under. We have a publishing division, which many of our projects fall under, and we have a video game division. And we have in that video game division, I had a person I know put into the position of the head of that division because they really wanted to make games. And what I think is interesting is, as a person who has been in the position, unfortunately, of having to lead groups many, many times before, when I had to lead our publishing work, besides a couple hiccups here and there, right? Generally, it was a position I could easily find myself in, right? And do X and do Y and figure stuff out. And I'm good at, and I think this is something to keep in mind. A leader is good at setting goals and figuring out how to get to those goals. Where a managerial position would be more of the nitpicky, you do A, B, C, D, E, F, G to get to goal Y.
Possibly, but I would say not always. And the reason that I would say not always is it's going to depend on the skill set of the person that you're leading or managing. So that's a great example that you gave. Let me give you another example. And this is one of my I always say this is my hot button. And if anybody is into any of this, I love the Myers-Briggs. I'm an IO psychologist, so I like lots of diagnostic tools. I'm certified on many of them, Myers-Briggs being one of them. I have the profile of being an INTJ, and the only thing that I'm even close to the center on is the N. But I am very much a hands-off type of person.
Hmm.
However, when I am under stress, and you just have to understand this about managers or leaders, when I am under stress, I will become a micromanager. Or if it's clear that the person isn't doing the work, I will become a micromanager.
Hmm.
So I just want to be thoughtful of leadership is situational. Not all people need the same type of leadership.
Hmm.
So for you, you could see yourself in the that position and you knew the person who was going into the role. But let's say bad scenario of you've hired somebody, you thought they had the skill set or you inherited them and it seems like you thought, they should be qualified, but they can't do the work. You can't lead them the same way as you lead somebody who's always all over it and getting their work
Well,
done.
and that's what I was about to go into because when I brought up that the individual who runs the
Mhm.
games department, they haven't led before.
Mm.
They are a very passive person. So when we had the first projects being pitched for that division, something they had to learn was not only how to project manage, because this is really they're just leading a project, but what we did as a almost a Turing test for them to see if they would be a good leader in that position is we had them go through the full pitching process
Mm.
of figuring out a team,
Mhm.
figuring out a schedule, figuring out a budget, things like that. But when you say, and I think this is very important, is I think something that people would be confused by, at least of what you've brought up so far, a leadership needs to know how to manage, or a leader has to. Because I think it
Yes.
depends. Of course, I think to some extent it's industry specific. Of course, I think in some businesses, some leaders will need different skills. But in something like film or creative arts, a leader is a completely different position than it is in business, because the way a leader operates depends, like you said, on the context of the thing. If you're a project lead, or if you're a group leader, or if you're a people leader, are all very different skill sets. But
Mm.
I think the most important thing to understand as a leader is you need to be adaptable in those skill sets. You need to be able to mesh into different skill categories, if that makes sense.
You need to be somewhat fluid.
Yes.
Your skills need to be fluid because I would argue a little bit that leadership skills are universal.
Hmm.
I think if you're creative, they may be demonstrated in a different way than if you're in a very formal, structured position. But the actual skill itself should be transferable. It's not like I'm a engineer doing aerodynamics for a car company and I'm moving over and I'm an engineer for a wastewater project. Those are skills that probably don't transfer.
Hmm.
But the concept of engineering transfers.
Hmm.
And a lot of things that I would say when I'm going out and I'm hiring a leader, which might be a little bit beyond the listeners for this, but
Yeah.
there are certain leadership skills that I look for, and maybe they haven't been in this area or this industry before, but the skill set is the value. You
Mhm.
can learn the detail,
Yeah.
but can you lead the people? And that's typically what you see. I probably wouldn't take somebody who's been in finance and put them over procurement as an example, and I wouldn't take somebody who has been a director in the creative space and put them over accounting.
Hmm.
But the concept, like you said, you took your head person through is, do you understand the pieces and the parts? And whenever anybody gets a new leader, they should expect that a good leader is going to come in and understand, they want to understand how all the work happens.
Hmm.
And it may feel like micromanaging when they come in, but if they don't know how the work happens, they can't help you remove barriers.
Hmm.
They can't help you when you come to them and say, this isn't working. They won't be as prepared to say, well, let's talk about maybe where some of the change points are. And we're digressing again just a bit, but a good leader would come in and say, I want to look at the flow of the work, which is
Exactly.
exactly what you just
Yes.
said. And I just did that a couple days ago with my team in a particular area of HR because I keep hearing, I've been hearing this now for 2 years. This is broken, it's not working, it's not working. And so I said, okay, what you need to do is sit down and do a value stream chart to say, this is how the work flows and where are the values in that. And you can do lots of different process maps, but that particular exercise, it's going to be over several sessions. It flagged immediately that you have people working outside of their area doing somebody else's job. So scenario, I'll get a little bit more detail. This value stream is for staffing.
Hmm.
It's for hiring people. But you have this admin and staffing doing work that needs to be a generalist's work, going into systems, looking at people records and stuff like that. That's not a staffing function. The staffer should be looking through resumes, assessing do they fit to the job description, but never should they be going, crossing, and it would be the difference between, your garbage collector now coming in and, cleaning up your food processor or
Hmm.
something. It's all similar, but it's not the same thing. And I think I'm saying that because what you talked about is having him have all of those experiences. That's what a good leader does, but a good leader does that themselves when they come in and say, "Look, I may have seen this 1,000 times, but walk me through your processes because I will only be a better asset to you if I understand what you're doing, where the challenges are." And when you come to me and say, "I can't get this done," I will have some concept of, well, how can I help you get that done? And that's what a leader should be doing. The number one responsibility of a leader is to remove barriers,
Mhm,
to set the goal, have the vision, measure everybody to the vision to some extent to make sure we're all getting there together, but to remove barriers. Not to fix things. And I say this a lot to my team. They bring me a problem and I say, okay, well, what do you want to do? Well, I want you to tell me what to do.
mhm.
Well, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I need you to think through what solutions you think are there. And then we'll talk about it and say, well, this solution would fix these three things, but it creates these two other problems. That solution would not fix it. And here's kind of why I don't think that's maybe the best solution. This solution, and you walk them through that because a manager tells you what to do, and then you don't know how to do it the next time because something might be different the next time you come across this, and that solution is no longer the right solution. A good leader helps you discover that, lets you make a few little mistakes that are not going to get you in trouble or end your career and say, okay, well, what did you learn from that? It's okay. I made those mistakes too. I also think a good leader says, these are the things I learned when I encountered that problem. So just keep those in mind as you're trying to fix the problem.
Well, and I think here's the biggest thing because you're talking about it. I worry. I see your mic is slowly
Oh, it's getting down in my
depressed
lap.
itself. Anyway, now that the mic is fixed, okay, so what I was gonna say was because you're talking about it a little bit. I think we are communicating the same thing on different wavelengths, right?
Probably.
Because here's what I always look as in a leader because I think something that isn't done, or at least isn't done well, is teaching people how to lead.
Mhm.
Because I do think in many situations, there are people who have to be leaders for certain things. And sometimes I think the biggest problem is that we don't have very many active resources available to teach people how to lead, right? So when I was teaching our head of games how to be a leader, I told them from my position is when I was talking to them, I was like, okay, here's what you need to understand on a broad scale, right? But you can't, at least in my mind as a leader, as we've talked about, I don't think you can accurately assess the broad scale without knowing the individual pieces.
I agree.
Right. And I think something that I was teaching them because I want this person, I know they are a very visionary heavy person, but I also know that they have their own incapabilities with some aspects of leading because of who they
Challenges.
are.
Okay,
Challenges. There you go.
challenges.
And because of that, I don't expect them to be the greatest leader of all time, but I do want to give them the training or experience of how to understand being a leader. Because I think a lot of people who want to do big things just don't understand the position of what being a leader and doing and leading a group for those things means.
Well,
Right.
and I don't want to give your readers a ton of assignments, but I would argue a little bit that there aren't good resources for how to lead. I think there are a ton of books out there.
There are, but people don't read
I was
those.
gonna say you
Right.
you
That's the
have to
problem here.
invest, and this is true with everything in the professional world. You have to invest in yourself. I mean, I
Mhm.
tell my kids this all the time. Educate yourself, be knowledgeable because nobody can take that away from you. Nobody can take out
The
of you what
most
you've learned.
this is gonna be very nerdy for a minute, a little bit of a digress, but something I always told people when I was going to college, right, is, whenever we make small talk about stuff, we talk about, "Oh, what do you do? What do you do as your hobby?" And something I remember always saying, and I still do this to this day, is they'd be like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I read." And they're like, "Okay, well, what do you read?" And I'm like, "Well, this is a little weird, but I read, like, the most obscure science articles," right? Because I look at it as this is just important as a general tool, not just for leaders. If you go into life after college and schooling and not try to educate yourself
Mhm.
further, you're going to run into into not problems, but I guess
You'll
hurdles more
stall.
often, you're gonna stall.
Yeah.
And something that even if you're not becoming a leader, for everyone who's listening or watching, education and
Mhm.
teaching things to yourself is one of the most valuable skills you don't wanna lose.
Well, and what happens on the same exact line of thought?
Yeah.
What happens is when you're a student and you're in high school or college, you are in a learning mode.
Yep.
And you know how to learn because that is where you spend most of your time.
Mhm.
I actually just had a colleague come to me, and his uh, daughter had graduated from college about 4 years ago, was working professionally, and now has gone back to get an MBA.
Mhm.
And he said, she's really struggling
Yep.
because she got out of that mode of learning how to learn. And so he was telling me how, her first semester, she was terrified she wasn't even going to get passing grades, where before she'd been a straight A student and
Yep.
she worked hard to get B's and C's.
Mhm.
Now it's her second semester and he's like, and she's nailing it. She's getting
Yep.
B's and A's every time. And it's because you forget how to learn. It's
Mhm.
it's a muscle mass. So it's like working out. You work out, you work out, you work out, you stop working out. When you get back into it, you have to reset those muscles.
Yep.
Learning is the same way. So I get that a lot of people don't like to read. I understand. And some people maybe even struggle to read because, they're on a computer all day I feel like that. I'm on a computer all day, reading all day, every day. I get home, my eyes are fatigued. I don't want to sit on my pad all night and read. I want to do more calming things, which maybe will come up later in a work-life balance
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
podcast we'll do. But there are other ways to consume the information. There are videos that you can have on in the background. You can do
Podcasts like the one you're
podcasts.
listening
You
to
can do
right now.
audiobooks. I mean, and you don't have to have a lot of money to do an audiobook. You can go out through your public library and download audiobooks. And I
Yeah, you
will
can
tell you,
rent
I
them.
have found that most of those development audiobooks are never checked out. It's not like the most recent
Yep.
novel. They sit there. But we could even, if you want to, Jake, I could even put down a couple of easy read leadership books that you can take, and just even understanding the concept of how to lead and how to listen. The best leaders listen,
Mhm.
to your point, and understand what the work is. And I will say this is another thing that I had on here. We haven't gotten to this yet, but make sure you want to be a leader.
Yes.
Not everybody is designed to be a leader. I know people older than me that have been working longer than me, and they are still an individual contributor 40 years into their career.
Which, to be clear, is not a bad thing.
No, they're very happy. They are very happy. They have, they've gotten more money, they've gotten more complexity in their job. They enjoy their job. Sometimes they're happier than leaders because they're only responsible for themselves
Mhm.
and getting their work done. But not everybody really is wired to be a leader. So if you want to be a leader, great. That's going to take investment, ongoing investment.
Mhm.
You don't just get there. I still hear about new approaches and want to listen to it to say maybe I could learn from that, right? And there are certain things I know that I'm not so good at. I'd like to micromanage less, but I know when I'm under stress and work isn't getting done, I will micromanage. And I tell people that if I start to micromanage you, you should take that as an indication of you're not getting work done. And I'll even say it. I'm going to have to step in because this is off track and I've
Mhm.
got to get it back on track. If that's not something that you like, and as a leader, you have to be prepared to be disliked sometimes.
Yep.
You're gonna be unpopular. You've gotta have tough skin because you gotta know that, the people that report to you, are probably talking to each other about something that you did that they don't like. You can't take that personally, and you can't be their friend. You're not a friend of the people that you lead.
Yep.
You can be friendly, but you are not colleagues anymore, and a
Yep.
lot of people have a hard time breaking that. So, I do say that's an important thing to know whether or not you wanna be a leader. And then as a leader, you have to know when not to address something,
Yep.
and that can be really hard, no matter how long you are in your career, because one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give out to, VPs and SVPs is let it just work itself out. Ignoring something is also a decision.
Yep.
I know it's a problem. I'm going to see if it works itself out. And as you get more experience as a leader, what you learn is most things do work themselves out.
Mhm.
Very rarely do they not fix the way they're meant to be fixed. And maybe you have to do a small soft plug, but you don't always have to address it. You also, as a leader, and this you might see this as leaders who's managing you, you have to know when to address things individually and when to address it as a group. Um, your leaders, I get that many people on this might think, these leaders suck. I would be better if I were a leader. Be very thoughtful before you judge because it is hard to lead people.
Well, and
And you're
something
getting the top pressure and you're getting the bottom pressure.
something I would actually, and then we'll get into what do you do if you have a bad leader, because I
Mhm.
do think that's an important topic to cover. But something I always think of as a leader, mostly just by fate being a leader, because sometimes you don't want to be a leader, but something I've always thought of is as a leader, and maybe your leaders don't show it, but something I value in people who are leaders or people I think could be leaders is caring a lot, not only about the work, but the people.
Yes.
Because I think you need to be, at least to some extent, a very empathetic person. That's not the word. Empathic person? Is that the word?
Empathetic is probably the
Is it
right word.
empathetic?
Yeah.
All right. Whatever the word
It's to
is.
be able to empathetic means I can understand where you're coming
Exactly,
from.
that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
That you want a leader who, to an extent, has that
Mhm.
ability, because a leader needs to understand how people feel in a project, right?
Yes.
And how people feel on a scale of work.
I
And I think it's important for a leader to have that understanding, even if they don't use that understanding in every single
mm,
instance they're in. I look at like the teams I lead for multiple projects and things like that, and I always make it my personal goal as a leader, besides doing the work that I assign myself, to make sure everyone not only understands, but everyone's doing well as people on top of that. Because it's not only I'm a leader and I watch everyone from my ivory tower as they do all their work, it's like I'm keeping an eye on everyone and making sure nobody's losing sight of the guardrails that have to be there to some extent. And it's my goal to make sure everyone continues to be passionate and continues to enjoy what they do. Because as soon as someone, say, hits a wall, to me, it's like I don't want that person to suffer hitting that wall by themselves. So I go to that person and have one on ones with that
mm.
person and things like that. Because the well being of the team that you lead is one of the most important things for a leader to understand, at
I
least.
I absolutely agree. I think there's another thing though that kind of goes hand in hand with that.
Hmm.
Leaders have to demonstrate consistent
Yep.
and anticipated behavior.
Yes.
So if I'm your leader, I can't, something happened and I am like, it's fine. And then the next time it happens, I'm not saying the next day, but in the same context, I blow up. I
Yeah.
go off the handle. It's different if it happens, it happens, it happens, it happens, then it starts to escalate. But, you know, I missed a deadline. Is that a big deal or is that not a big deal? And if
Hmm.
you have leaders that are inconsistent with how they respond to that, you don't know how to anticipate what they're going to do.
Hmm.
And so the advice I give to more senior leaders is you need to be predictable. Your people need to know, is this going to be a big deal or not a big deal?
Hmm.
So that's a big piece. But the empathetic, and that's a little bit of being empathetic to say they need to be able to anticipate and respond accordingly and say, okay, this one I'm going to get ahead of because I know it's going to make Jolene upset. This one I'll just manage and I'll just mention it to her in our one-on-one. It's not that big of a deal. On the same side though of being empathetic, I don't know what's going on, but I begin to see this as like a rash of these behaviors. So as a leader, you come to me and I'm going to make this very simple. This isn't the scenario that I'm thinking of, but let's say for example, you report to me, Jake, and you come to me and say, I need to take vacation on Friday. And I
Yeah.
say, that's fine. And then you come to me on the next Friday and say, I need to take vacation on Friday. And I say, okay. And the next Friday you come to me and say, I need to take vacation on Friday. And I say, okay.
Mhm.
Then, as a leader, I go to HR and say, "This guy's taking every Friday off." I can't I'm not kidding you, this stuff is starting to happen. And I think it's because they're not good leaders. They don't wanna in your face say, "Well, wait a minute. You can't take every Friday off. Is there something going on that I need to know about?"
Yeah.
Because when you take every Friday off, that puts the burden on everybody else. I want everybody to take a Friday off periodically, or it's remote work or whatever it is. And then and this has come to me, and I have some HR folks on my team that say, "Well, they wanna discipline this person because 'cause they've been off every Friday." And as the empathetic person looking at it from, an arm's distance, I say, "But hold on a minute. They approved it.
Mhm.
They told Jake that he could take those 3 Fridays off. Why are they mad at Jake? They need to be mad at themselves. They
Mhm.
need to say, "No, you can't take Friday off." Or another one that is similar is there's a blackout period. Some groups, like let's say finance, you have all of these activities that happen at the end of the quarter or at the end of the month. And so you have to have everybody who's responsible for that in place to do those things. So you may say, these 2 days are a blockout period. Nobody can take vacation in that blockout period. Now, let's be honest, being the empathetic leader, somebody's kid got sick. They can't
Mhm.
control that. Somebody has to go in because they have COVID. Somebody's fell and broke their leg. These things happen, right? And you have to manage that and say, those are exceptions. I don't like it, but we have other places and, we have other things in place to manage that effectively. However, let's say, for example, somebody comes during that blockout period and says, I want to take these 2 days off. And the manager says, okay. And now the manager is upset with you because you took those 2 days off and says, "You know what? That's a blockout period. You should never take those 2 days off."
Mhm.
I look at that and say, "That's a failure of the manager or the
Mhm.
leader because you should have said, 'No, those are blockout days. Nobody can take those off unless there's some type of an emergency.'"
There's a cat on
There's a cat
video
hitting
again,
me in
just
the
to be
head with
clear.
her tail. Um, and so those are important things too. So you have to be empathetic to a point,
Yep.
but you have to also have consistency around your practices, and everybody has to know that the rules for Jake are the same as the rules for Jolie,
Yes.
right? He doesn't get anything special or anything different, but if he has a catastrophic issue, he's going to get that time off.
Mhm.
And I think this is where leaders get frustrated because a lot of times they come to HR and say, I want to do X. And we say, well, the problem is not the person. The problem is how you're managing that situation. You need to be different. Don't tell them they can take time off and then zing them after they take time off. That's not okay. And I use time off because I think it's easier for your listeners, but I'm seeing it in lots of different areas where I say, but you told them it was okay. Yeah, but it wasn't okay. Okay, well then you should have said it's not okay. And I think that's the symptom of a bad leader.
Mhm.
They're afraid to tell you to your face no, or they're afraid to say no to something that you've asked for, and that's not good for anybody else on the team. Okay, did you wanna get into what to do if you have a bad leader? Are we at time?
Let's get into it a little bit because you
Okay,
did kind of start. We don't have much time left in this
okay.
episode, though.
I can be fast.
So I think I'll start with just a quick rundown of bad leaders I've run into, right? And then you can go into what to do in that situation, right?
Okay.
So I'll give an example. Like I remember when I was in a position, um, and I remember in this position, it was a very unclear set of tasks, right? They gave me a set of tasks, and I didn't understand how any of the tasks connected together, or if they were separate, or if they were different projects, or something like that. And that leader never made that clear. So when I asked the leader, hey, what is the goal of X, Y, Z? What is this? And a lot of it was busy work. And I'm like, okay, whatever. And when we then had some days where I went in and it was a completely changed schedule where it's like, oh, don't do any of those tasks today. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. Where they're kind of all over the place. That is like the only time I think I've run into a bad leader and it didn't really affect my personal output or individual contributions, but it did make it very confusing because you go in expecting to do one thing and you come out doing something completely different, and it's just weird to understand that. Now, in that position, what I did is I approached them and asked,
Mhm.
right? Because I felt like that was what I could do in my position. And they explained a lot of it was kind of just throwaway work we needed someone to do. And we didn't have a huge team, so I was the person to do it, and that's fine. I understand that. But not making the clear connections between A, B, C, at least for some of them, where some days I would go and work on something, then the next day it'd be like, forget all of that. We're doing this now. And not even having any sort of preemptive understanding, right? Which I understand sometimes. Like I've had on some more creative projects, I've had to run and grab stuff
Mhm,
randomly because that's just the nature of the
mhm.
creative industry, right? I do think, at least to me in that position, that leader didn't make it entirely clear where the end goal was. Which I do think is something a leader should do. Where are the goalposts I'm kicking for? But tell us about what
Well,
your position is, I guess,
I
or
guess
your
in that
thoughts.
particular scenario, listening to it, of course, because I'm an HR person, I would say you have a leader there that probably doesn't know what the end goal is.
Hmm.
They are just responding.
Yep, they're
They're just
reactive
reacting
almost.
to
Yeah.
whatever's happening. And it's hard when you have a leader like that. I don't know that that's a bad leader. I think that that's a bad situation that the leader hasn't circumvented in some way.
Yes.
They may not know how to. And so in that situation, having heard this for the first time,
Hmm.
you're managing up. You're going to
Yes.
have to manage up a little bit. And I think the one thing that you did really well was to say, I asked him, how do all these things connect? Another way to do that is I would hypothesize based on my own experience and the fact that I'm an IO psychologist that that person is not a visual thinker. That's
Mhm.
why they're just reacting. So another way to do that is to sit down and try to draw out a picture of I think this is a bucket of work and this is a bucket of work and this is a bucket of work. And sit down with them and say, okay, I'm trying to figure out where I place the work that you're giving me so I understand its context.
Mhm.
That's always a big one. And I sometimes am running really fast and I'll have somebody say, I don't understand. Is this standard work that we're going to be doing from now on, or is this a one off? I appreciate that because then that as tells me as a leader, I didn't give you enough context. Now, I think most of the people who report to me will say I give them way too much context because I'm like, well, before you do that, I want you to understand why this is
Got to
happening
set up the questions.
because that's just how I'm wired. I don't want you to be me. I want you to be better than me. And if I only give you the answer and I don't explain the context, I don't think you'll get there. But to your example to go back, I think that's one thing I would recommend. A second thing that I might recommend is and this might be hard if you have a leader who's really volatile, so use it if it's appropriate, is to say, what's the purpose of our team,
Mhm.
of our function? What are we do, what is the output? What do we contribute to the business? And in a creative role, let's say you're doing something like I'm going to throw out like social media or you're in marketing or something.
Mhm.
Sometimes those folks are just very much reacting, especially like in communications. Oh, I've got a certain cadence of things, but then I'm just reacting to asks from the business. That makes it a little bit harder. I don't know that all of your readers would be in that space where it is that reactive, but another way to get to there is when you have time, if it's not a fire drill. And I think if you're in an internship or a co-op program, you're probably doing a lot of throwaway work. So just be understanding of that and patient. And you're just a worker bee and they're just throwing you stuff to keep you
Yep.
busy. But if this is a regular full-time position for you, it doesn't hurt to go around to other people and say, the work that you do, can you just like give me the 411 of what you do and how does that feed into my work or how does my work feed out to you? And then you'll be able to get a picture for yourself and then you can pressure test that picture back with your leader.
Mhm.
I find when you have leaders like the one you described, they're never going to be good at giving you that picture
Yeah.
because that's just not how they're wired. And that's very disruptive for people who are very structured and organized. So
Mhm.
some leaders are very structured and organized, and some leaders are out here just
Out in
kind of,
space,
yeah.
flying
And
around.
that's a mismatch of styles.
Mhm.
As a leader, that's why I said it's situational. You should be able to jump down and manage them the way they need to and pop up. But I don't think that that's common. I don't think that most leaders are able to do that.
Mhm.
Do you want me to hit on any others or
If you want to, we could
okay?
also come back for a second
Well,
episode of
I only
this.
have 3, so I think I
Okay,
can be
then go
quick.
ahead.
Yep. So I think if you have a bad leader, and I'm talking about like a malicious leader or a snarky leader, somebody who it's going to happen, they yell at you, or you feel like they're undermining you behind the scenes, or I literally in my career, and sometimes I'm just flabbergasted. I've had pretty very senior leaders, not pretty, very senior leaders who have basically told me, I would never have hired you, and I don't want you here. And so,
Whoa.
I look at that and say, okay, well, at least I know now why nothing I ever do makes you happy. But in that situation, and maybe yours isn't that extreme, but it could be because that happens at every level.
Mhm.
You just need to be cautious. You need to say, okay, I now know where we stand. So I'm going to make sure I am very thorough. I am very complete in what I do. I am documenting my work. I am providing that documentation. I am walking you through. I would say that more one-on-one time would be helpful there because maybe they will change their opinion. Sometimes they won't. But just make sure that you're very thoughtful. Don't talk about it. Don't gossip about what was said. Maybe go to HR if you want to. But if you repeat any of those things, it will never bode well for you. So that's when you say, okay, I'm going to internalize that and figure out how I change it. But, going around saying, you won't believe what he said to me today, that's never going to end well for you.
Mhm.
It may not end well for the leader either, but it's never going to end well for you. So in that type of situation, you need to be cautious and say, what do I control that will ensure that I can be successful? You can wait out the leader, you can prove the leader wrong, or you can vote with your feet and go someplace else. Um, I think it's really important when you have a bad leader to have a network of people,
Mhm.
not to complain to, but to say, I'm really struggling in, delivering Jake's expectations on X. I know you've worked with him for a while. Can you give me some pointers? How could I do that? Or go to another department and say, you have a leader that really seems to be excited and publicizing all the things that his team are doing. How do you interact with him? What are you doing that really sets you apart? And getting those positive stories of what success looks like could help you rethink what you want to do.
Mhm.
And of course, I will always say this, work with HR. HR a lot of times can help you. But HR is not, remember, we talked about in an early podcast, we're not here to fix things for you.
Mhm.
We're here to make sure things are legal, ethical, and moral. And then we're here to help guide you and help guide the leader. Um, so even be a little bit thoughtful of what you tell us if you don't want us to address it. Because if you've told us something like that somebody said something that egregious, we will probably have to address it. And then I kind of alluded this to the first one, but you want to be focused on, can you live with this or not?
Mhm.
And this will flow into other podcasts around work-life balance. If you have a leader who's never happy with anything that you ever do, and you're having to work a lot more time to redo things, or you're stressed to the point, and that's happened to me where it's like, I just either need to wait this guy out or I need to go someplace else. And I say guy, it could be a gal. Then you need to decide, is this the right place for you? It's horrible to think that I need to move where I am. But if you're in an environment that allows that to happen, and you can't figure out how to fix it. Not everything can be fixed. You probably need to say in a thoughtful way, this might not be the place for me. And we talk about toxic environments. Maybe that's toxic, maybe it's not. But go ahead and start looking. Don't quit a job until you have a job. I can't tell you how many times I've interviewed people and I'm like, we haven't been working for 9 months. Oh, yeah, I was in this toxic environment. Yeah, that doesn't sell well
Mhm.
to the next place because you're like, I wasn't there. I don't know about it, but I know you just left a job. And so would you do that to us?
Mhm.
Or are you just going to walk off with us? So just think about how you sell that. But I think you've got to pick, can I work through it? Can I live through it? Or am I going to leave?
Mhm.
And those are really the three options you have with a bad leader. We all will have them, and the world isn't fixed with a magic wand that somebody can fix that for you. And one of those three things will happen. Bad leaders typically fuzzle out,
Mhm.
but I've been places where people say, "Well, he's been like that for 20 years," and you think, "Okay, well, we're never going to fix him then if he's been allowed to do that for 20 years." And the only thing we can do is probably fire him or her, or get them out of a position where they're supervising
Mhm.
people, or they can quit. Because if you've been allowed to be that way for that long, you're not going to change.
Yeah. Well, I think that was a pretty productive episode. We
Uh-huh.
covered a lot, I think, in the
I
leadership
think so
department.
too.
However, we do want to end off with this is that as we finish up season one, which will be 12 episodes long, and possibly have a season two, if you guys want us to talk about any topics, feel free to
Mhm.
share. You can find us on our social medias at Faux Productions, FAUX_productions, or Prod, or something like that. It'll be on it's down there probably. I
Hopefully
assume it's
hiding
all
me, it's right here.
information. So you can find that. You can also comment on the podcast pages or the YouTube comments or whatever, because we always like hearing more topics. But
I would say I would love to hear comments around, is this helpful or not? What didn't we cover in these broader comment or topics that you'd like to see? And then what do you want to see?
with that, we'll end this episode.
Perfect.
Thank you all for coming. We'll see you all next week where we're talking about work life balance.
Okay.
And we'll see you all then. Bye bye.
Bye.